Hello, everyone, and welcome to James A. Garfield National Historic Site's first ever virtual President's Day event. Normally, we have a large event here at the site in Mentor, Ohio, every President's Day, and have hundreds of people out here on the site to enjoy and learn more about presidents. This year, we're doing our first ever virtual President's Day event. My name is Todd Arrington. I'm the site manager here at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, and I'm going to be presenting for you today a short program about similarities and differences between Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, and James A. Garfield, our 20th president. There are some similarities and differences between these two men that are probably pretty obvious. There are also some things that I think may surprise you here that are similar and different about both Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. We'll start with Abraham Lincoln because, of course, he is one of the inspirations for President's Day. He was born February 12th, 1809 in Kentucky. Yes, he really was born in a log cabin. His mother, whose name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was only about 9 years old, so he did endure the death of a parent. He was very close with his mother, and he did mourn her loss for the rest of his life. His father did eventually remarry to a widow who had children of her own. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, and she and Abraham, her stepson, the future president of the United States, grew very close. And in fact, she actually was still alive in 1860 when Lincoln was elected president. She was obviously quite elderly by then, but she was actually still alive and did live to see him elected as the 16th president of the United States. One of the things that sort of reached the level of mythology about Lincoln is that he had little formal schooling. And this is one of those rare cases where the mythology is actually true. Lincoln really did not have very much formal schooling. He estimated that his entire school career, where he regularly attended school, amounted to less than 1 year of formal education over the course of his life. He also moved several times as a young person. Born in Kentucky, as I said, lived for several years in southern Indiana, and then eventually on to Illinois. And of course, Illinois is the state with which Abraham Lincoln is most famously associated. And Illinois is the state today that calls itself the land of Lincoln. So, what about James Garfield? He was born here in Northeast Ohio, November 19th, 1831. He also was born in a log cabin. And in fact, James Garfield is our last president who actually was born in a log cabin. Like Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield endured the death of a parent. In this case, it was Garfield's father, whose name was Abram Garfield, and that's what the A in James A. Garfield stands for. It's James Abram Garfield, not Abraham, Abram. His father, so James Garfield's father, Abram, died. Abram was about 33 years old at that point, and his son, the future president of the United States, was only about 18 months old. So James Garfield went his entire life with no real memory of his father. His mother, who he also grew very close to, because she was his only parent, she did briefly remarry when he was a teenager. That relationship was quite unhappy and somewhat tumultuous. James Garfield did not get along very well with the stepfather, and his mother and the stepfather eventually divorced. And there's a great quote from James Garfield's diary when he is president-elect of the United States. So he's been elected, but not yet inaugurated, where he notes that he learned that this former stepfather of his had died. And he writes something, I'm paraphrasing, but to the effect of that he could never think of this man without contempt. And so it was obviously not a great relationship. His mother was the one who insisted that he get a good education. James Garfield, as a young man, dreamed of going to sea and living life as a sailor. The furthest he ever got was working on the Ohio and Erie Canal, where he fell into the canal several times, had never learned how to swim, got sick, had to go home, and his mother kind of nursed him back to health. And she was the one that really convinced him that he should go try to become a good student rather than a tow boy on the canal or a sailor. He lived, most of his adult life in Ohio. Now, of course, he did later spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. But unlike Abraham Lincoln, who moved around and whose permanent residence moved around quite a bit from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois, James Garfield's permanent home was always Northeast Ohio. And as I already mentioned, he did also have a very good relationship with his mother. So in his case, it was his mother. In Abraham Lincoln's case, it was his stepmother, who became a very close relationship for him. Abraham Lincoln didn't really have that great a relationship with his father, Thomas Lincoln, and their relationship was strained enough that when Thomas Lincoln died, his son Abraham did not even go to the funeral. James Garfield, as I said, did not have a relationship with his father simply because his father died when James was only about 18 months old. As far as early political careers, Abraham Lincoln was initially a member of the Whig Party. The Republican Party at this point did not exist. So Lincoln was an admirer of Henry Clay, who was a Whig, and so Lincoln joined the Whig Party as a young man. And he was openly ambitious for office. Lincoln ran for a lot of offices that he did not win. And we tend to think of political figures of this era in our history sort of not being overly ambitious for office, or at least not being overtly ambitious for office. And that was not really the case with Lincoln. He was very ambitious and wasn't really ashamed of that ambition. So he did run for office many times. Sometimes he won, sometimes he lost. He served several terms in the Illinois state legislature. And then he did serve a one term in the U.S. House of Representatives in the late 1840s. And his most notable accomplishment there was giving a speech that was very critical of President James K. Polk and the Mexican-American War. So that was Lincoln's one exposure to actually serving in the national legislative body. And then, of course, we know that James Garfield spent quite a bit of time in the House of Representatives as well. James Garfield, as a young man, he was a lifelong member of the Disciples of Christ, which is kind of a homegrown Protestant denomination. And initially, as a young man, did not think that good Christians should really be involved in politics. Thought that it was sort of unchristian to be involved in politics. But James Garfield was also extremely ambitious, and he really, more so than Lincoln, adhered to the social norms of the time, which basically stated that you should not appear to be overly ambitious. And Garfield decided very early on, when he eventually came to grips with the idea of being involved in politics, that he would never overtly seek an office. He always would let the office come to him. Garfield went to school here in Northeast Ohio. And it wasn't really until he went off to college up at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, when he became politically active and believed then that it was acceptable for him to be politically active. Abolitionism was very popular in Massachusetts and in New England. And Garfield, who had grown up on the Western Reserve of Ohio, and who had always, opposed the idea of slavery, even though he really didn't get involved in it politically as a young man while living here in Ohio. He really did get his beginnings of being politically active up in New England while he was attending college at Williams. He came back to Ohio after graduating from Williams and became a teacher and then eventually the principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. That is what is now Hiram College here in Northeast Ohio. And then also in 1859, he agreed to stand for election to the Ohio State Senate, and he did stand for election as a Republican. So the Republican Party had been formed in 1854 and was growing nationally, and Garfield affiliated with the Republican Party, and of course, so did eventually Abraham Lincoln. So Garfield was elected to the Ohio State Senate in 1859, and went to Columbus as kind of a part-time Ohio State Senator, and that's where he stayed between his regular job at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute and his, if you will, part-time job as an Ohio State Senator. Those are the things that he was doing up until the beginning of the Civil War in the spring of 1861. As far as family life goes, Abraham Lincoln was married to Mary Todd Lincoln. They were the parents of 4 sons, but tragically, only one of those sons survived to adulthood, and that was their very first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, his middle name there for his mother's maiden name. Robert Todd Lincoln was born about a year after, not quite a year after his parents were married, and he is the only one of the 4 sons that survived to adulthood. 2 of the other sons died in early childhood. The last son, Thomas, who everyone called Tad, who is sort of famous for being in photos with President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, he did outlive his father, but then he died as a teenager. So none of the, or rather only one of the Lincoln sons survived to adulthood. Robert Todd Lincoln, as an adult, was an attorney. He was a businessman, and he, of course, was constantly being sought after to run for office. And he resisted that because he was convinced that nobody really wanted him. They only wanted him because his last name was Lincoln. And then finally, he decided at one point not to run for office, but to agree to serve in a presidential cabinet. And he did accept the position of Secretary of War, the forerunner of the modern Secretary of Defense. And he accepted that position from President James A. Garfield. So Robert Todd Lincoln did serve in President James Garfield's cabinet. Today, there are unfortunately no more living descendants of Abraham Lincoln because so many of his sons died young before they had children of their own. Robert Lincoln did marry and have children, but that line has also completely died out. So there are no direct descendants of Abraham Lincoln left, unfortunately. As far as James Garfield's family life, he married his wife Lucretia Rudolph Garfield in 1858. They eventually had 7 children, 2 daughters and 5 sons. And they also, like the Lincolns, did endure the loss of children. Their very first child was a daughter named Eliza, named for James Garfield's mother. Their very last child was a son named Edward. Those 2 children both died in childhood. So like the Lincolns, the Garfields did know the pain of losing children to diseases that were common at the time and for which there was no cure. 2 of their sons, Harry A. Garfield and James R. Garfield, also went into public service. They worked directly for other presidents. Harry A. Garfield was the federal fuel administrator under President Woodrow Wilson during World War I. And James R. Garfield was the U.S. Served on the U.S. Civil Service Commission and in a number of other positions. And then his public service culminated with his 2 years as United States Secretary of the Interior under President Theodore Roosevelt. The last 2 years of President Theodore Roosevelt's term in office, 1907 to 09, James R. Garfield was Secretary of the Interior. And one major difference here between Lincoln and Garfield is simply that we are lucky to have many, many Garfields still with us, including many of them right here in the Cleveland area where our site is located. So there are hundreds, perhaps more, Garfield descendants still in the United States today. A very stark contrast between no more Lincoln descendants living. Lincoln and Garfield both had some military service. Certainly Garfield's service is the more distinguished of the 2. Lincoln volunteered for an Illinois militia unit during the Black Hawk War in 1832. This was a war with American Indians. He was elected as a captain of his company, and this was in the era when soldiers often voted on who they wanted to be their officers. And so Lincoln was elected captain, and he said until the day he died that this was one of the greatest honors that he'd ever had bestowed upon him. And this, of course, is a man who was twice elected president of the United States, and yet the knowing that his men thought enough of him to elect him captain of the company was something that meant a great deal to him. Lincoln never really saw any combat in this very short-lived Black Hawk War. And in fact, he himself joked that most of the battles he fought were with mosquitoes, so he didn't really see any actual combat during this time. And that was the entirety of Abraham Lincoln's military service. James Garfield, however, did volunteer to fight for the United States in the Civil War. He believed from very early on that the war was all about slavery. And he believed that because he was young, and as he said, he was big and strong, and he had no excuse for not enlisting, he did feel that it was his duty to fight to not only preserve the Union, but also to eradicate slavery. So by August of 1861, when the war had only been going on for a few months, State Senator James Garfield became Lieutenant Colonel James Garfield, and was soon in command of the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. That is a unit that Garfield not only commanded, but also a unit that he helped raise. And in fact, many of his students from the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram enlisted in that unit and went to war fighting under Colonel Garfield, who had not too long before had been the headmaster or principal of their school. Garfield kind of threw himself into his work, as he often did throughout his life, despite having no military background, no connection to West Point or anything like that. He taught himself really how to be a soldier and how to command a regiment. He led with distinction. He won his first battle at Middle Creek in Kentucky in January of 1862, and at that battle he fought a larger Confederate force, and also a Confederate force that was commanded by a Confederate general named Humphrey Marshall, who was in fact a West Point graduate. So Garfield managed to win that battle. He was promoted to brigadier general, and then later, shortly before he left the Army, he was promoted to major general. Probably the most famous battles at which he fought: Middle Creek, which I just mentioned; Shiloh, he was a brigade commander by then, and at Shiloh his brigade arrived really right at the end of the battle, so they didn't really see a lot of action at Shiloh. But he was heavily engaged at Chickamauga. By the time of Chickamauga in September of 1863, he was no longer commanding troops. At that point, he was a staff officer. He was the Army of the Cumberland's chief of staff. So he was not commanding troops, although he did play a very important role in that battle. He was not in command of troops himself at Chickamauga. He was a staff officer by then. And like a lot of Civil War veterans on both sides, he was often called by his rank for the rest of his life. Even as president of the United States, a lot of people still referred to him as General Garfield, and this was very common for Civil War veterans on both sides of the conflict for the rest of their lives. So how did these two men feel about slavery? I mean, it was the most important political issue of the era in which they lived, and it was the root cause of the Civil War. So how did Lincoln and Garfield feel about slavery? Lincoln was certainly always anti-slavery. He said as early as the 1830s that the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy. But Lincoln at this point did not feel that the government could do much about slavery, at least in the places where it already existed. What Lincoln wanted to avoid was slavery expanding, and particularly expanding to the West. That, of course, is where he lived. He was from Illinois at this point. He was living in Illinois. So Lincoln and many of the other people who founded the Republican Party, many of them were abolitionists and wanted slavery eradicated, but there were probably even more people joining the Republican Party who grudgingly accepted that slavery could exist where it already was, but what they wanted to stop and to prevent was the expansion of slavery. So Lincoln and many other early Republicans wanted slavery to be contained. If you think about, say, 100 years later after World War II, when presidents were like Truman and Eisenhower were trying to contain communism because they feared this domino theory that communism would expand from country to country to country. They kind of had the same idea 100 years earlier with slavery. They didn't want slavery to be able to expand, and that was really the one of the founding principles of the Republican Party, stopping the expansion of slavery. Lincoln said and wrote many things that are make us a little squeamish today in the 21st century. He openly said as late as the as late as the Lincoln Douglas debates, and even as president, that he did not feel that the black man was the intellectual equal of the white man. But that also didn't mean that he thought that they deserved to be enslaved either. So, Lincoln, like almost everyone who lived in the 19th century, has some, shall we say, complicated feelings about not only slavery, but about social relations and social equality between Black Americans and white Americans. What about James Garfield? How did he feel about slavery? Garfield never called himself an abolitionist, but looking back on it now, we can say that's pretty much what he was. Garfield was actually far more vocally anti-slavery than even Abraham Lincoln. Garfield believed slavery was illegal and immoral according to both the Constitution and to the Bible. Again, remember, he was a devout member of the Disciples of Christ. And Garfield also believed correctly that slavery was, in fact, the root cause of the Civil War. Yes, we hear conversation about things like states' rights and differences about different interpretations of the Constitution and economics, and these things are all somewhat played into the argument, but they can all be traced back to ultimately being differences about slavery, about the existence of slavery, about the profitability of slavery, about the legality of slavery, and about the expansion of slavery. And so Garfield was one who, of course, was not was not in elected office by the time that he was saying a lot of these things. He was in the army or about to go into the army, and was able to really be much more vocal about these things. But he was very adamant that it was all about slavery. And in fact, just 2 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, Garfield wrote a letter where he told the person he was writing to, "The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe the final outcome will redound to the good of humanity." So Garfield was saying, 2 days after the war started, that everyone knew it was really all about slavery. However, Garfield was also not perfect, and like Lincoln said and wrote some things that, again, make us a little uncomfortable today in the 21st century. He noted at one point in a letter to someone that, quote, "I could never get myself to fall in love with the creatures," and by the creatures he means African Americans. And he also noted at one point, "I refuse to pat the black man on the back simply because he is black." But Garfield also was a reliable uh, a reliable vote on legislation when he eventually became a member of the House of Representatives that did seek to protect the formerly enslaved and to give them political and civil rights. So while he said some things, privately that maybe are a little tough to hear today, he was very much a reliable, if you want to call him radical Republican, not a great term, but when it came to trying to enforce and provide security for the formerly enslaved after the Civil War. Lincoln and Garfield were both also highly regarded as speakers and gave some famous speeches. Lincoln, of course, participated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858 when he ran for a U.S. Senate seat in Illinois against the incumbent Stephen Douglas, who was the Democrat. And they agreed to debate several times around all over Illinois. And, that was really where Lincoln started to catch a lot of people's eye as a potential 1860 Republican presidential candidate. He gave the famous House Divided speech during that same Senate campaign. In fact, when he was accepting the Republican nomination to run for the Senate, he made that famous comment that, I believe a house divided against itself cannot stand. The nation cannot endure half slave and half free. It must become all one thing or all the other. He gave a very famous address at Cooper Union in New York City in February of 1860. That also garnered a lot of national attention and made him seem like a potential presidential candidate for the Republicans. Of course, both of his inaugural addresses are very highly regarded as rhetorical masterpieces. And then, of course, the Gettysburg Address, probably arguably the most famous speech in human history, or one of the probably the 3 or 4 best known speeches in human history, and the one in which he really redefined what the Civil War was really all about. Probably none of James Garfield's speeches are as well known as those speeches of Abraham Lincoln, but Garfield was very, very highly regarded as an orator and very much sought after as a speaker as well throughout his political career. During his 17 years in the House of Representatives, he was very, very highly regarded as a speaker. And that's reflected by, for example, him being asked to give the keynote address on May 30th, 1868, in the first National Decoration Day ceremony. Decoration Day is now what we know as Memorial Day, where we honor men and women killed in the service of their country. And of course, the very first National Decoration Day took place in Arlington National Cemetery, which had previously, before becoming a cemetery, been the home of Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general who resigned from the United States Army, and then eventually became the most famous of all Confederate commanders fighting against the United States. In 1880, James Garfield also went to the Republican National Convention in Chicago, and at that convention, he gave a speech nominating Treasury Secretary John Sherman to be the Republican presidential candidate in 1880. Garfield went to this convention, first of all, as very secure in his own position. He'd been in the House of Representatives for 17 years, but had just a few months before been elected by the Ohio legislature to the U.S. Senate. So Garfield knew he himself was heading to the United States Senate at the beginning of 1881. John Sherman had supported Garfield. John Sherman, also from Ohio, the brother of the famous Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. John Sherman supported Garfield for that Senate seat, and then in return wanted Garfield's support for his own presidential bid in 1880. Garfield agreed to that. Garfield knew that John Sherman had very little chance of actually being nominated for that of actually receiving the 1880 Republican presidential nomination, but he kept his word and went to the convention and gave the speech for Sherman. And when the convention sort of entered a deadlock, a lot of people started thinking about Garfield himself as a potential compromise candidate rather than voting for somebody like John Sherman or Ulysses S. Grant or James Blaine or any of the other announced candidates for the presidency for that nomination in 1880. There certainly had been people prior to this convention who were pushing James Garfield as a potential compromise candidate if the convention became deadlocked. So the idea that Garfield sort of came out of nowhere is a little overblown, but I don't think anyone really, including Garfield, really expected him to come out of that convention as the presidential nominee. But to say that no one had ever even considered James Garfield as a candidate in 1880 is not really true. There were some people that were very small groups of people in certain parts of the country that were pushing for a Garfield candidacy, and that is eventually what came to pass. And of course, probably one of the most significant similarities between Lincoln and Garfield is that they were both Republican presidents of the United States. Lincoln, of course, was the 16th president elected in 1860, and he was the first Republican ever to serve as president. It's a pretty impressive achievement when you consider that the Republican Party was only created in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And by 1860, they had managed to elect a president of the United States. In 1860, of course, Lincoln did not win any southern states. In fact, there were some southern states where his name didn't even appear on the ballot, because, of course, Southerners by this point had convinced themselves, or their leaders had convinced them, that Lincoln, was just what they called another damned black Republican, that he was going to immediately march into the South with the army and to abolish slavery. None of that was true, by the way. Lincoln had said many times his goal, his only aim was to keep slavery contained to where it was, but he did not make any threats to actually abolish slavery. But of course, that all changed when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861 and started the Civil War. At that point, for Lincoln and for the United States, the gloves came off, I guess you would say. Lincoln, of course, was reelected president in 1864. Southern states, of course, then didn't even vote because they were seceded, or at least called themselves seceded. You could sort of have a semantic argument about, did they actually secede or did they attempt to secede? But for whichever way you come down on that argument, Southern states were not voting for president of the United States in 1864. So Lincoln won re-election in 1864. And of course, today, modern members of the Republican Party still like to call themselves the Party of Lincoln. Modern Democrats claim him too, because of course the parties, both of the major parties that still exist today, have changed and evolved and really, in some cases even kind of reversed ideologies over the years. So both members of both major parties today will claim Abraham Lincoln as one of their own, and of course that's understandable because Lincoln is highly regarded as, by most people as the greatest president in American history. So it's natural that everybody would want to claim him as one of their own. James Garfield, of course, also a Republican president. He was the 20th president of the United States. So he was elected in 1880, 20 years after Lincoln's first election in 1860. He was the fourth Republican to serve as president and the third Republican in a row. Of course, we had Lincoln. Then after Lincoln's death, we had Andrew Johnson, who was, had been Lincoln's running mate in 1864, but was actually a Democrat, was not a Republican. And then after Johnson, then we had Grant, Hayes, and then Garfield. And then after Garfield's death, Chester A. Arthur. So we actually had 4 Republican presidents in a row. Garfield was, in fact, a compromise candidate in 1880. He had not announced that he wanted the presidency. He was someone that, the Republican Party settled on at that 1880 Republican convention in Chicago, simply because no one else really could get the nomination at that point. None of the major candidates had enough votes, and so the party needed a compromise choice. And because of the speech he had given for Sherman, and because of a number of other factors, almost everyone agreed that Garfield would not do any harm to the party or to the country as president, and so he was a compromise choice. He won a very narrow election. In fact, his victory in the popular vote was something less than 10,000 votes out of however many millions of votes were cast. Still the closest popular vote victory in American history. And that victory was over the Democratic candidate, General Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock, still on active duty in the United States Army. Hancock, though a lifelong Democrat, was also a West Point graduate and a career soldier in the United States Army, had fought for the United States in the Civil War, severely wounded several times, including at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this 1880 election, which pitted Garfield against Hancock, was in fact the only presidential election in American history in which both major party candidates had fought for the United States during the Civil War. So it was basically 2 Union generals going up against each other in the 1880 presidential election, and Garfield came out on top. Again, won by something less than 10,000 votes, razor thin margin. And when told the next morning after he got out of bed that by his wife, in fact, Hancock, when told that he had lost, a very close election, said, "It's okay, I can stand it." And so he was not, he was very gracious in defeat. And in fact, he attended Garfield's inauguration and was very complimentary to President Garfield. Garfield, of course, never had the opportunity to run for re-election in 1884 because the last similarity between Garfield and Lincoln, tragically, is that they were both assassinated presidents. So both Republicans and both assassinated. Lincoln, of course, is shot on April 14th, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. Booth, a somewhat famous actor and a Confederate sympathizer originally from Maryland. Booth thought he was avenging the South, avenging the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War by shooting Lincoln. And in fact, all he did really was kill the one person who wanted to treat the South somewhat gently in Reconstruction, and the one person who, in fact, could make that happen. So Booth, in fact, should be a greater villain in American history than he is, even for killing Lincoln, because he really did kill the one person that wanted to treat the South somewhat fairly and somewhat gently after the Civil War. Lincoln died about 9 hours after being shot. Never regained consciousness. Booth shot him in the back of the head at Ford's Theater, famously, and Lincoln never woke up. Booth got away. He famously jumped off out of the presidential box and ran across the stage, and supposedly yelled "Sic Semper Tyrannis" when he was making that leap off of out of the box and onto the stage. He escaped down into Virginia, but was caught and killed about 10 days later. So he was on the run for about 10 days, and then finally was caught and cornered and killed by federal troops about 10 days after shooting President Lincoln. And then we have, of course, James Garfield, our 20th president, who was shot on July 2nd, 1881 by Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was unquestionably mentally unbalanced. Also, Guiteau considered himself a Republican, and there was a lot of factionalism in the Republican Party at this point. And Guiteau considered himself a member of the opposite faction from Garfield, and he was very upset about what he viewed as Garfield's plans to reform the civil service, to get rid of the patronage system, and to institute a system of civil service jobs being distributed based on merit rather than on, to the victors go the spoils, so to speak. Guiteau, yes, did want a job in the administration. A lot of books kind of write him off as a disgruntled office seeker. Yes, he was that. He did want a job. He was disgruntled because he'd been told he was not getting the job that he wanted, which was to be the American consul to either Vienna or Paris, for which he, of course, had no qualifications or experience. And then after this disappointment of not getting this job, and of course the mental instability that I've already mentioned, he kind of became convinced that God was telling him that the only way to save the Republican Party and to save the country was to kill President Garfield and make Vice President Chester A. Arthur the new president, because Arthur, in Guiteau's mind, was from the right side of the Republican Party. And so this was his plan. He carried it out, shot Garfield on July 2nd, 1881. Did not kill him. Garfield lingered for about 80 more days, endured some pretty horrific and wrong-headed treatment from his medical team, from his doctors, and eventually died September 19th, 1881, from infection that his doctors had introduced into his body, not from the bullet wounds. Most who look at it today and know anything about medicine agree that Garfield probably would have healed up and been relatively normal had the doctors just left him alone to heal, but instead they insisted on probing his back and his wounds with, unwashed hands and instruments, and they eventually introduced infection into his body, and that is what killed him, not the bullet wounds themselves. Guiteau, unlike John Wilkes Booth, did not escape and really didn't make much of an attempt to escape, actually. He was captured immediately upon shooting Garfield in the Baltimore and Potomac train station in Washington, D.C. Guiteau was convinced that he would not face any real consequences here. He was convinced that Chester A. Arthur, upon becoming president, would pardon him and would give him a job and would take good care of him. And he was convinced that he'd done the right thing for the Republican Party and for the country. Kind of a sad story there, really. That of course did not work out in Guiteau's favor. He was executed by hanging on June 30th, 1882, just 2 days shy of the 1-year anniversary of his attack on President Garfield. As far as remembrance, Abraham Lincoln is still highly regarded, as I mentioned earlier, as the greatest president in American history. Usually comes out on top of polls ranking presidents. Sometimes he's one spot below George Washington, but most historians generally consider Lincoln the greatest president in American history, and he's the second most written about figure in human history, behind only Jesus Christ. So certainly there's a lot of remembrance of Abraham Lincoln. For James Garfield, he's been sort of written off, unfortunately, as kind of an afterthought or a footnote in American history. He was only president for a few months before he was shot. Kind of inconsequential. Obviously, we at James A. Garfield National Historic Site don't agree with that assessment. And we think that, yes, he was president very briefly, but the entirety of his life leaves behind an impressive legacy. Both his feelings about civil rights, his service to the United States, and both in the Army and in Congress. He left behind a large family, and there are still hundreds and hundreds of Garfields out there. So we don't agree that his life or even his presidency was inconsequential. So, and thankfully he's getting a little more attention these days, thanks to some recent books, a documentary that came out on PBS about 5 years ago. So he is starting to get a little bit of a second look from people, and we certainly appreciate that. So with that, I will conclude. Normally, this is the time I would ask for questions, but since this is being recorded, there's no opportunity to ask questions. But I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a little bit about some of the similarities and differences between Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. And I hope that it's been something enjoyable for you to do as part of our first ever virtual President's Day. So thank you for listening and watching, and happy President's Day, everyone.